In 40 years on this bench, I've seen greed take many shapes. But there is a distinct level of malice reserved for those who look at a lifetime of honest labor and see nothing but an opportunity to balance their luxury ledgers. Those who sit in high rise penthouses with spreadsheets and decide that the security of thousands of elderly workers is simply a liability to be liquidated. They hide behind financial jargon while families watch their life savings vanish, knowing that the retirement earned through decades of sweat was erased by a single corporate keystroke. That is the story of the workers at OmniSteel, men and women who gave 40 years of their lives to this city. People like Arthur Jenkins, 67 years old, with calloused hands and a faded blue uniform he wore proudly. He spent his youth in the heat of the foundry, all so he could secure a modest pension to care for his disabled wife. The total fund stolen was $84 million, the entire retirement nest egg for 1,200 families, wiped out in less than 6 months by a predatory hedge fund that promised security but delivered ruin. The man responsible was sitting right there in my courtroom. His name was Vance Caldwell, 52 years old, managing partner of Caldwell Alpha Holdings. He drove a $320,000 Aston Martin and received a $22 million bonus the exact same year he emptied the pension fund. I remember that Tuesday morning when I saw his name on my docket. Vance James Caldwell. The charges were grand larceny, securities fraud, and institutional embezzlement. I read the case file the night before and had to step away twice to maintain my composure. In 40 years, I have trained myself to remain detached, but seeing 1,200 ruined lives versus one man's obscene wealth tested my restraint. I arrived early at 7:55 a.m. with a cup of black coffee. My clerk, Elena, had prepared the way my father taught me. I was staring at a photograph of Arthur Jenkins on his retirement day. Elena walked in quietly. "Judge," she said softly, "the workers are packing the gallery today, and Arthur's testimony is going to be heartbreaking." I looked up. "What is Caldwell's defense strategy?" Elena sighed. "They call it market volatility optimization, arguing that the collapse was just a bad day on Wall Street." Elena took a deep breath and handed me another folder. "Vance Caldwell has been running Caldwell Alpha Holdings for 9 years," she explained. "Under his leadership, the firm shifted its focus to what they call distressed asset optimization. In plain terms, Your Honor, they target stable manufacturing companies with healthy, fully funded pension plans. They buy a controlling stake using massive debt, shift that debt onto the company's balance sheet, and pay themselves tens of millions in bonuses. By the time the company suffocates and declares bankruptcy, the pension fund has been legally stripped bare. They call it the asset stripping protocol, and it is entirely deliberate." "And what about the OmniSteel families?" I asked. Elena's voice faltered. "The liquidation went through 6 months ago. 1,200 workers woke up to find their retirement accounts completely wiped out. Arthur Jenkins is just one of them. His wife, Martha, suffers from severe illness and requires daily care. Arthur had planned their retirement based on the company's pension promise. Now, he is forced to work night shifts as a security guard just to afford her medication. The stress is devastating them, Judge. Every month of delay from the hedge fund's legal team pushes these elderly folks closer to absolute ruin." I closed the file as the courtroom doors opened. The gallery filled rapidly, packed with men and women in faded work jackets, their faces etched with decades of hard labor and recent betrayal. In the front row sat Arthur Jenkins, his large, calloused hands resting heavily on his knees. Next to him sat his wife, looking frail but determined. Vance Caldwell arrived at exactly 9:11 a.m., 11 minutes late. He walked in without a glance at the gallery, wearing a bespoke gray suit that cost more than a steelworker made in a year. His gold cufflinks caught the lights, and he moved with the absolute confidence of a man who believed his wealth made him untouchable. Behind him marched 4 elite corporate defense attorneys, led by Marcus Sterling, a lawyer famous for shielding Wall Street predators. "Mr. Caldwell," I said, my voice echoing coldly through the silent room, "you are 11 minutes late." "Mr. Jenkins has been here since 8:45. He left his ailing wife's side to be here. The least you could do is show up on time." Caldwell adjusted his tie, offering a smooth smile. "My apologies, Your Honor. Traffic was unavoidable." 11 minutes, Mr. Caldwell, I replied. "Remember that number. We will be returning to it." The prosecutor, Patricia Holden, stood up deliberately. She was 41 years old, a career prosecutor who had spent 6 years dismantling corporate fraud syndicates before coming to this district. She was methodical, thorough, and absolutely devastating with financial evidence. She did not look at the defense table. She looked directly at the jury box and then turned her gaze toward me. Your Honor, Patricia began, her voice steady and cutting through the tension of the room. The state intends to prove today that Vance Caldwell and Caldwell Alpha Holdings did not merely make a bad investment. They engaged in a calculated, predatory campaign of financial extraction, specifically designed to drain the life savings of honest citizens. We will demonstrate that this asset stripping protocol was implemented with full knowledge of the human collateral it would leave behind, and that Mr. Caldwell personally signed off on the execution of this scheme. Marcus Sterling was on his feet instantly, his expensive silk tie catching the light. Objection, Your Honor. This is an outrageous mischaracterization of standard corporate restructuring. My client operated within the full boundaries of the law. Mr. Sterling, I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice dropping an octave. You will have your opportunity to speak. Let the prosecutor proceed. Sit down. Sterling sat down, his face a mask of smooth irritation. Patricia Holden turned toward the gallery. Your Honor, I would like to call our first witness, Mr. Arthur Jenkins. Arthur Jenkins walked to the front of the courtroom. He moved slowly, his shoulders slightly bent from 40 years of carrying the weight of heavy machinery. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life working without complaint, only to be ambushed at the finish line. He took the oath, his voice low but clear. Mr. Jenkins, Patricia said gently, tell the court about your time at OmniSteel. Arthur looked down at his hands, then up at the court. I started at the foundry when I was 22 years old, he began. It was hard work, hot work, but it was honest. We took pride in what we built. We were promised that if we gave our sweat to the company would take care of us when our hands grew too old to work. I did my part. I never missed a shift in 40 years. I watched my friends get hurt, watched the industry change, but I stayed because of that promise. That pension was not a gift, Your Honor. It was deferred wages. It was the food on our table today and the medicine for my wife tomorrow. Prosecutor Patricia Holden continued her presentation of the financial evidence with absolute precision and cold resolve. She stepped up to the projector at the center of the courtroom, displaying statistical charts that revealed the staggering growth of Caldwell Alpha Holdings, a growth that perfectly mirrored the total evaporation of the OmniSteel Workers' Pension Fund. Your Honor, Patricia announced, her voice piercing through the heavy silence of the room. We intend to show the jury the true nature behind this hedge fund's operation under the direct command of the defendant, Vance Caldwell. When he acquired OmniSteel 9 years ago, the Workers' Pension Fund was in a state of full surplus, with 100% of its capital securely guaranteed. But look at this financial timeline. In less than 6 months leading up to the forced bankruptcy, the entire $84 million was systematically drained through ghost management fees, intricate cross-lending schemes, and most notably, massive individual performance bonuses. Miss Holden pressed a button, switching to the next document on the large screen. These were highly secured internal emails obtained by the prosecution after months of intensive investigation. On the screen, an email sent from the office of Vance Caldwell himself read with chilling cruelty. The target to liquidate the entire OmniSteel pension fund must be thoroughly completed before the third quarter. Optimize the legal terms to ensure that the reduction of our pension liabilities is not delayed or disrupted in court. Remember, every single dollar we retain from the workers' pension fund is a dollar contributed directly to the executive year-end bonus pool. In the gallery, waves of furious whispers escalated into a roar of outrage. Elderly steelworkers looked at each other, their eyes red with anger, helplessness, and bitter realization that their entire lives of labor were nothing more than a feast for someone else's balance sheet. I had to repeatedly bring down the gavel to maintain control. Order, absolute order, in this courtroom, I commanded, my sharp gaze sweeping across the crowd. Prosecutor Holden continued without flinching. Your Honor, we hold over 800 pages of internal communications, proving this was a meticulous, systematic campaign to strip citizens of their assets. And most significantly, we have undeniable proof that the defendant, Vance Caldwell, personally signed off on this so-called distressed asset optimization protocol, a beautiful term used to hide the parasitic draining of a perfectly stable manufacturing company. Mr. Caldwell was not an innocent bystander. He knew that gutting this pension fund would plunge 1,200 families into poverty, yet he executed it anyway just to protect his $22 million bonus. I turned my eyes away from the file and stared directly at the defense table. Vance Caldwell's arrogant, untouchable smile had completely vanished. His jaw twitched, and his hands gripped each other tightly under the courtroom lights. His lawyer, Marcus Sterling, immediately bolted upright, attempting to use his polished elite stature to intervene. Your Honor, I object strongly. These emails are being presented maliciously out of context. My client was merely making legitimate financial restructuring decisions to save a failing enterprise in accordance with current corporate laws and economic regulations. Mr. Sterling, I cut him off, my voice dropping like a block of ice, exerting an absolute weight that made the expensive attorney freeze instantly. The email chains explicitly show unique electronic signatures and direct commands originating from your client's personal account. He was not saving an enterprise, he was harvesting it like an apex predator. Sit down and let the prosecutor finish presenting her evidence. Sterling bit his lip, slowly lowering himself back into his seat, his face masking the first signs of genuine panic. Prosecutor Patricia Holden walked back to her table and picked up a single sheet of paper, holding it up like a weapon. Your Honor, she said, her voice dropping into a dangerous calm, we have established the system. Now, let us look at the direct execution. We have an email chain from exactly 8 months ago. A senior financial compliance officer inside Caldwell Alpha Holdings, a woman named Sarah Lynn, sent a high-priority memo directly to Vance Caldwell's personal inbox. The subject line read simply, OmniSteel pension red flags. The prosecutor projected the email onto the large screen. She read the words aloud, ensuring they burned into the minds of everyone in the room. Miss Lynn wrote, and I quote, the current asset stripping timeline will completely deplete the OmniSteel retirement reserve by November. This will leave over 1,200 retirees without their promised healthcare supplements and basic pension incomes. The human impact is severe. I am requesting an immediate executive freeze on this liquidation before we face catastrophic legal and reputational exposure. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the heavy breathing of the men in the gallery. Patricia Holden turned the page. And here, Your Honor, is the response from Vance Caldwell's private account, sent just 4 hours later. It reads, request denied. Maintain the current liquidation posture. The third quarter profit metrics must be met to secure the year-end distribution pool. Legal will handle any future exposure. Proceed. The gallery erupted. Men stood up, shaking their fists. The heavy wooden benches creaked under the weight of decades of suppressed anger suddenly boiling over. I brought down the gavel heavily, 3 times, the sharp cracks echoing like gunfire through the room. Order, I commanded. Order in this courtroom, or I will have the bailiffs clear every single seat. When the room finally settled into a trembling silence, I stood up from my bench. I walked down the steps, moving slowly until I was standing directly in front of the defense table, removing the physical distance between justice and the accused. I looked down at Vance Caldwell. His arrogant composure was finally cracking. His jaw was locked tight, a visible muscle twitching beneath his pale skin. The gold cufflinks on his wrists seemed to lose their luster under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mr. Caldwell, I said, my voice carrying into every corner of the room without me even needing to raise it. Do you deny the authenticity of this document? Did you look at a direct warning that 1,200 elderly citizens would be ruined and decide your $22 million bonus was worth more than their survival? Marcus Sterling stepped in front of his client, trying to shield him. Your Honor, my client receives hundreds of risk assessments daily. He relies on his legal team to handle compliance issues. This is a corporate decision, not a personal assault. He personally reviewed the file, Mr. Sterling, I said, looking directly past the lawyer into Caldwell's eyes. His own assistant confirmed it. He looked at the faces of these workers on paper, and he chose the spreadsheet. The silence in the room was suffocating. Vance Caldwell swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward his lead attorney, but Marcus Sterling remained frozen beside him. For the first time in his professional life, the shield of corporate bureaucracy had failed to protect him. The paperwork could not hide the blood on his hands. Mr. Caldwell, I continued, my voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls, I want you to look at the gallery behind you. Turn around and look at them. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, his neck turning just a fraction of an inch before he stopped, refusing to lock eyes with the people he had ruined. "You cannot do it, can you?" I said, stepping even closer until I could see the fine beads of sweat forming along his hairline. "You can look at their life savings on a digital spreadsheet in a glass tower and wipe it out with the click of a mouse, but you cannot look them in the eye in a house of justice. You see 1,200 liabilities. I see 40 years of honest, back-breaking sweat. I see men who stood in front of blazing furnaces in the dead of winter to build the beams that hold this city together. I see women who sacrificed their health to ensure their families had a future. They paid into that fund every single month without fail. They kept their end of the American dream, and you treated their sacrifice like a carcass to be picked clean by Wall Street vultures." Vance Caldwell's face flushed a deep, angry red. He cleared his throat, finally breaking his silence against the frantic, silent gestures of his defense team. "Your Honor, you are letting emotion cloud the economic reality," he stammered, his voice losing its smooth corporate veneer. OmniSteel was an outdated operation. It was bleeding cash. The restructuring was the only way to save the core assets. The pension restructuring was a standard, legally permissible protection under Chapter 11 bankruptcy guidelines. "We followed the statutory framework. Do not lecture me on the statutory framework, Mr. Caldwell." I shot back, my voice cutting through his defense like a scalpel. "You did not restructure the company to save it. You systematically suffocated it. You loaded a healthy manufacturing plant with $84 million of toxic debt from your own investment failures, forced it into an artificial crisis, and then used the legal system as a getaway vehicle to carry off the retirement funds of honest citizens. That is not capitalism, sir. That is institutionalized piracy. And in my courtroom, the law is a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the greedy." I walked back up the steps to my bench, the weight of 40 years of judicial authority settling over the room. I looked down at the defense table one last time before turning to the prosecutor. "Miss Holden, do you have any further evidence before this court proceeds to a final determination?" Patricia Holden stood tall, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "The state rests, Your Honor." I sat back in my chair, the weight of the entire room pressing down into the thick silence. I looked at Arthur Jenkins and his wife in the front row, then turned my gaze back to the defense table. "Mr. Caldwell, stand up," I ordered. Vance Caldwell rose slowly, his hands smoothing the front of his expensive suit, attempting to summon the remnants of his corporate dignity. But his eyes gave him away. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, trapped calculation. "Vance, James Caldwell," I said, my voice steady, carrying the absolute clarity of the law. "In 40 years on this bench, I have rarely seen a case where the line between absolute greed and human suffering was drawn so clearly. You took the security of 1,200 families and treated it as disposable capital for your personal gain. You were warned of the human cost, and you chose your bonus pool over their survival. Therefore, this court finds you personally, criminally liable for grand larceny, securities, fraud, and institutional embezzlement. I am sentencing you to 8 years in federal prison." The courtroom instantly erupted. Outcries of relief from the gallery collided with shouts of panic from the defense table. 8 years, Caldwell stammered, his face turning an ash-gray color as he stepped forward against the warnings of his legal team. "Your Honor, this is completely insane. I am the managing partner of a major financial institution. We manage billions in assets. I have shareholders, market obligations, and an entire firm that relies on my daily leadership. A sentence like this will destroy corporate value and cost thousands of innocent jobs. You cannot do this to me." "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell," I thundered, bringing the gavel down with a sharp, final crack that silenced the room. "Sit down right now, or I will add immediate contempt of court to your sentence. Your wealth does not purchase immunity here, and your shareholders are not the ones who spent 40 years sweating in a steel foundry." Marcus Sterling bolted to his feet, waving his arms frantically. "Your Honor, this sentence is wildly disproportionate to standard regulatory penalties. My client never intended to cause personal harm. This was a structural liquidation. Your client received a direct warning from his own compliance officer." I cut him off, pointing a finger directly at the defense table. "He was told by his own team that 1,200 elderly citizens would be ruined, and he personally typed the command to proceed just to protect his year-end bonus pool. That is not a structural failure. Miss Sterling, that is a conscious choice. And in my courtroom, choices have absolute consequences. I adjusted my robes and leaned forward, looking directly at the corporate legal team. Additionally, I am issuing a mandatory enforcement order against Caldwell Alpha Holdings. I am ordering the immediate, unconditional restoration of the entire $84 million pension fund to the OmniSteel workers. This order is not pending further corporate review. It is not subject to structural delays, and it will not be tied up in bankruptcy restructuring. It will be executed immediately, in full. Furthermore, I am ordering Caldwell Alpha Holdings to pay $50 million in punitive damages to be distributed directly among the families who suffered under Mr. Caldwell's asset stripping protocol. I am referring this firm's entire financial history to federal regulators for a comprehensive criminal investigation, and I am recommending to the Securities Commission that your operating license be permanently revoked. Take him into custody. The bailiffs moved forward with absolute purpose toward Vance Caldwell. He backed away from them instinctively, his eyes darting wildly around the courtroom as though expecting someone to step in, as though expecting the sheer mass of his wealth and his social position to suddenly materialize as a shield between him and the cold reality of a prison cell. But there was no shield. There were just two uniformed bailiffs, a pair of steel handcuffs, and 40 years of a judge who had seen every single version of this exact moment. "I am Vance Caldwell," he muttered, his voice cracking as if the name itself should be enough to halt the gears of justice. "I know exactly who you are," I replied coldly. "Take him away." They clicked the handcuffs around his wrists. His $320,000 Aston Martin was still sitting out there in the parking garage. His 4 luxury estates were still his, at least for now. His $22 million compensation package had already been spent on things I did not even care to think about. But none of that mattered anymore in my courtroom. In this room, he was no longer a financial titan or a master of the universe. He was simply a thief who had let 1,200 elderly workers suffer for months just to protect his personal bonus structure. And now, he was facing the absolute weight of his consequences. As they led him through the center aisle, he passed the very front row where Arthur and Martha Jenkins sat. He refused to look at them, keeping his eyes glued to the floor, but Arthur Jenkins looked straight at him. I have been watching the faces of human beings in courtrooms for 40 years, and what I saw on Arthur's face in that precise moment was not a look of triumph. It was not a petty desire for vindication. It was something far more profound and complicated than that. It was the face of a man who had spent months fighting a losing battle for his family's survival and had finally won, but who understood completely that winning a legal battle could never truly give back the months of terror, could never undo the sleepless nights, and could never fully guarantee the years ahead. The corporate board of Caldwell Alpha Holdings approved the total restoration of the $84 million pension fund within 4 hours of the sentencing, operating under emergency legal duress from their own terrified compliance attorneys. Arthur Jenkins stopped working the grueling security night shifts the very next week. His wife, Martha, was admitted to a specialized care facility, receiving the exact treatments and medications she required without a single bureaucratic delay. The $50 million in punitive damages was systematically distributed, throwing a financial lifeline to hundreds of families who had been pushed to the absolute brink of ruin. Vance Caldwell's high-priced appeals were flatly denied by the higher courts. He served his time in a federal facility, learning firsthand what it means to live in a world where your balance sheets mean absolutely nothing. 11 months after that historic day in court, Arthur Jenkins wrote me a letter. It was not a long letter, because he was never a man who used more words than were absolutely necessary. He wrote, "Dear Judge Boyd, my 10-year-old grandson asked me last week if there are still real heroes who fight for the working people who built this country. I told him that heroes do not usually wear hard hats or steel-toed boots, and sometimes they wear black robes and sit behind a massive wooden desk, but they exist anyway." He thought about that for a very long time, and then he told me he wants to grow up to be that kind of man. I thought you should know. Thank you for saving my family. I have received thousands of letters over my 40 years on this bench, and I have kept very few of them. I kept that one. If this story moved you, If you are deeply outraged that a predatory hedge fund stripped a lifetime of honest savings away from working class citizens while its chief executive pocketed tens of millions in bonuses, share this story everywhere. Share it with every single person you know who works hard every day and trusts that the system will be there to protect them when their hands grow too old to labor. I am Judge Boyd, and I want to say something directly to every Wall Street executive, every corporate raider, and every single person who sits in a glass tower holding power over the life savings of ordinary citizens. When you decide to liquidate a pension fund, you are not making an economic adjustment. You are making a profoundly human decision. You are making a decision that has devastating consequences for real people, for real families, and for proud men like Arthur Jenkins, who gave their youth to build this nation. And when those decisions are made in bad faith, when they are driven purely by corporate greed rather than legitimate operational reality, those decisions will eventually stand before a judge. And in my courtroom, a worker's lifetime of honest sweat is worth more than a corporate bonus structure every single time. Arthur Jenkins can sit on his porch and breathe easily now. That is what true justice looks like. Court is adjourned.